And I'm going to go over a few housekeeping things before we get started this morning. Our session today is in Zoom webinar, so that means that all participants are muted and your videos are off. We are recording the session and we will make that available soon after. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen for any questions. We should have time for questions and answers at the end of the session. Our American Sign Language interpreters will be on screen throughout the session. You can change your view at the top portion of your screen. And we are also using captioning this morning. If you do not see that, press the CC button at the bottom of your screen. We know that there's going to be technical difficulties and we appreciate your patience. So here are the important slides for anyone wanting continuing education credit or certificates of attendance. You must be in the content portion of the webinar for at least 90% of the session to be eligible for a certificate. This is a mandate by the boards. Please do not leave the webinar until the conclusion of the Q&A, as that counts as part of your session. You do not have to enter your contact information in the chat because your attendance and your time is tracked by Zoom. If you received the link from a friend or coworker, we will not be able to track your attendance and you will not be eligible for a certificate. It's really important to register and use the same email address to register for each session throughout the learning series. Around the first full week of December, you'll receive an email from me that will provide a link to access the session evaluation, then your certificate. This is a screenshot to show you the landing page for the evaluations and certificates. You must complete the session evaluation to proceed to the certificate. And lastly, you are responsible for printing your own certificates. We do not mail or email those anymore. This website that you're seeing on the screen houses several years of the System of Care Academy. So if you lose your certificate, you can access this website to print another. And now let's learn about our presenter. Janna Estep Jordan is the Director of Operations and Prevention Education at Prevent Child Abuse Kentucky, which is the Kentucky chapter of Prevent Child Abuse America. Janna has been part of the Prevent Child Abuse Kentucky since 2006, and she oversees and coordinates the annual Kids Are Worth It conference, in addition to providing technical assistance to over 250 agency partners, coordinating with collegiate athletic associations regarding child sexual abuse prevention policy and education. And Janna may be familiar to you as she has provided over 450 presentations and trainings across Kentucky, furthering PCAC's mission to prevent the abuse and neglect of Kentucky's children through advocacy, awareness, and education and training. And welcome, Janna.
Thank you all for having me, and thank you to all of you for attending today. I'm going to share my screen so I can pull my PowerPoint up with you. All right, so today we are going to talk about poverty and how poverty and neglect may go hand in hand, but in a different way than you think. So today's training, Poverty and Neglect, Understanding the Difference in Supporting Families and Children Living in Poverty, is something that has been, I guess I could say, a long time coming for Kentucky. In 2021, around August, we held the state's first ever neglect summit. And to be quite honest, it is one of its kind. There are other groups across the nation and other states who are currently mirroring what Kentucky did to see how they can do the same thing in their state. So a lot of the information in today's slides comes to us from the information we gained through that summit, as well as national experts in the field. So who is Prevent Child Abuse Kentucky? Lee gave you a little glimpse into who we are and read our mission. You know, our number one goal is to prevent abuse and neglect before it ever occurs. And we do that through community programs, public education, advocacy, and targeting everyone. Because in order for us to prevent child maltreatment, we have to involve everyone in our communities. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to look at some of the outcomes of that neglect summit. And one of those is the change to the neglect statute. So state law in our state that looks at how we substantiate child neglect. We're going to differentiate between poverty and child neglect. We are going to identify prevention tools. So when we think about true prevention of child neglect, what leads to neglect? What leads to abuse? And then if we know these things, what are some concrete tools that you can use in your work with families and children throughout your walks of life that you can make an impact in your daily work? And then we're going to look at ways of communicating these messages to getting to individuals throughout our Commonwealth. So here we're looking at that statute change. So prior to 2022, our state law was in regard to neglect. When you went to look at whether a child was a victim of neglect, we followed this law that said a caregiver does not provide the child with adequate care, supervision, food, shelter, clothing, or medical care necessary for their well-being. So there can be a lot that goes into that definition, but what it didn't do was differentiate when there were parents who were out there trying their best with the resources that they had at their fingertips. It didn't differentiate those folks from parents who were willfully neglecting their children. So what you see here is after 2022, the update to that statute that added that language when financially able to do so or offered financial means to do so. And this is language, I think at the time of our neglect statute, and I could be wrong on the number of states, but there were about 12 other states across the nation who had made this shift, who had already changed their language to ensure that families that were trying their best were not penalized for living in poverty. So let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk about prevention and understand a little bit better what primary prevention is versus reacting and responding after we assume or suspect abuse or neglect has occurred. So if I'm out there in the community today, walking down the street, and I see somebody physically abusing their child, I see that, I know it's happened, and I know that my duty is to report to the appropriate authority. That is what we refer to as tertiary prevention. So reacting and responding after abuse has occurred. We know this is needed because we know that kids who are in harm's way, who are abused or neglected, need to be supported. Now, the other form is secondary prevention. So this might be targeting different groups that we seem to find to be at risk. So it might be targeting families that have substance abuse issues with programming, because we know substance abuse and child maltreatment can go hand in hand. So targeting various groups, that is what tertiary prevention is. Now, I want us to go upstream and think about primary prevention, where we are supporting all families. So the key word there is all, before the abuse or neglect ever occur. You know, in our nation in one day, so a single day like today, we spend $220 million to address child abuse and neglect after it has occurred. Think about the impact that has in our own state, in our tax dollars, in time missed from work. I mean, I could go on and on. But the great thing about moving upstream is that for every $1 we spend on child abuse and neglect prevention, we later save $4 on those back-end services. So let's look at prevalence and why it's significant that we focus on child neglect. Well, as you can see here, this is a pie chart that indicates the substantiations by maltreatment type in the state of Kentucky. So in 2021, the child maltreatment report showed that 74% of our child maltreatment substantiations were due to neglect. And that is not something that is different than across the nation. We see that across the nation, child neglect represents 74 to 76% of all cases. So Kentucky ranks similarly to others across the nation in that form. We also know that oftentimes we're getting ready to get into research, kind of the proof is in the pudding, so to speak. But we know oftentimes that families have been penalized for living in poverty and have had substantiations for things that were beyond their control. So knowing this, we want to begin to shift gears. We want to think of this beautiful little example of moving upstream and think, okay, if we know that there are certain factors that lead to child neglect, if we know that there are protections we can put in place to strengthen families, then, sign me up. How can we do this? How can we collaboratively work together to move upstream? So first, let's get into a little bit more of an understanding of when a referral is accepted for criteria with Child Protective Services. So according to the Child Maltreatment Report, we have two different referrals we're going to talk about. One is called a screened-in referral. And a screened-in referral is a referral that meets CPS criteria for an investigation or alternate response, and that's based on state law and statute. So you can see a significance of having that statute altered. Now, the other thing I want us to think of is what a screened out referral is. And a screened out referral is a referral that does not meet criteria. It doesn't meet standards or practice or to launch an investigation. Now, what we know is that in Kentucky, according to this child maltreatment report, we had 49,108 referrals that were screened out of 95,000. So that's almost half. So what I want us to do is stop for a moment and consider that. Think about the opportunities with the screened out families. So if we know they don't meet criteria for acceptance, we're not going to get into the details because we know there are various different situations for each family and each individual who suspects abuse or neglect. I want us to think of the big picture and think of all the opportunities that not Child Protective Services has to support these families. We see that there's a common theme across the nation, and it's that the general passerby or the person in the community that sees a family in need, they automatically think of Child Protective Services, or they think of some other entity that's responsible for supporting that family. And we tend to see the lack of focus of people standing up and saying, you know what, that's my job. That's how can I reach out to support this family? So I want us to think about that. That's one reason we go over those screened in and screened out referrals, so that we can see all the possibilities that are out there for strengthening these families. We have to consider a lot of things when we think of that. And one of those is ownership of the problem. Again, we see that people tend to put ownership with one agency or certain agencies. We see that the way that we advertise data, or the way that child abuse might be presented in the media, might lead the general individual across the state to have their own solution of what might occur to prevent child abuse. Or they might not even perceive that there's a solution at all. They might think that the problem is too large to handle, so why would it matter? What could I do to change it? We see that research also shows this, that when the general public continues to see messaging such as Kentucky ranks #1 for child maltreatment, that it lends to that. It lends the general person seeing that messaging to feel hopeless, to feel despair, to where they don't feel like if I did something, it would make any change. People might not know what to do. They might hear that families are in need, but they might not know how to reach out or how to help that family. And we see that one thing that came out of the Neglect Summit was a huge correlation between people not understanding that poverty and neglect are different, and that we cannot provide surveillance, or we can't penalize families just because they don't have the resources at their fingertips that others might have available to them. We also saw that implicit bias goes hand in hand with that oftentimes people might make assumptions about parents in poverty that might not be true to that family or individual. And then we see again that there's so many missed opportunities for other agencies, community members, civic groups, places of worship, just anyone and everyone to step up and help support these families. So let's talk about that. If most parents who hurt their children are doing their best during tough circumstances, they're just like us. We know that maltreatment crosses all economic, racial, ethnic, and religious boundaries. So it is a myth that abuse is more likely to occur in any particular race or ethnic group. But what we see is that sadly, we know implicit bias comes to play, especially when we look at families in poverty and making reports of child neglect. So let's define what implicit bias is. It's a form of bias that occurs automatically and unintentionally. So somebody might not be sitting there judging someone on purpose. It's the way that our brain makes these connections based on our environment and what we've been through in our own lives. So we make these mental shortcuts that lead to how we make decisions or how it affects our judgments and our behaviors. So what we have seen is that families living below the poverty line are 3 times more likely to be substantiated for child maltreatment. Furthermore, through this research from Chapin Hall, they found that 53% of all Black children will be investigated for child abuse before the age of 18. And we know that those kids are not substantiated. We know they're screened out. So that lets us know that there's that implicit bias factor coming to play there. Black children represent 14% of the population, but we have 23% of those children living in foster care. So let's consider implicit bias. We know that it impacts the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding of actions and decisions in that unconscious manner. So again, not something we're doing purposefully. Everyone has them. If anybody is a parent or a grandparent who has been a teacher, daycare worker, and you've worked with kids, have you ever had that moment where you see a kid mimicking you and you realize, oh no, they're mimicking me and I do that behavior and it's not something I would want to be a role model for? You know, I think a lot of people might have that opportunity. I found that when my daughter was little, she was 2, I used to say crap. And so she started saying it and I thought, oh no, she's repeating after me. So everyone has bias. They might not align even with our beliefs or values, but it might be our environment and how we were raised. It develops early. It can be influenced by parents, culture, media, and environment. And what we know through this research is that we typically gravitate to or favor people that seem to be like us. So if we have a population of a lot of white people, we have found that research has shown they are less likely to report on Caucasian, 2-parent, middle class households. So again, thinking of those mental shortcuts, our thinking is guided by this framework that's called schema or mental models. So you think of that past experience, you know, growing up, whether it's throughout your place of worship, your neighborhood, your school, your home. It helps frame our assumptions. It helps with our beliefs and what we're thinking. And we also know media plays a huge role in that. And even now, I think we see that social media is having a significant impact on that thinking. And again, starting from a very young age. So here's where this research and this information helps us think about, okay, how do we message things in a way that help get the general public, our fellow coworkers, other service providers to understand all right, we're going to have a shift in thinking. We're going to reframe how we serve families. This helps us understand what we've done wrong. And I use Prevent Child Abuse Kentucky as an example, and I'll get into that in a minute. But we have found that our cognition, our culture, the communication strategies that we have been using reinforce personal attributions of responsibility and obscure systems. So what all of that means is that all of the messaging we've created and we've used, like Kentucky ranks #1 in child maltreatment. Why isn't Child Protective Services doing this or that, which we tend to see as a huge focus when there's media articles. What this has done is it has allowed the general public to think this isn't a problem. This isn't my problem. It's the problem of this group over here. Or they misperceive the solutions or don't get those solutions. They don't understand that what they can do can make a significant impact. So knowing this, we know that we have to reframe. We have to quit saying things like Kentucky ranks #1 or Kentucky ranks 5th for maltreatment. We have to have intentional framing to improve our understanding of these issues and build support for programs and policies and from the folks that are working alongside with us or walking down our streets. So here's a little riddle. Most people might have heard of this riddle. So please, I love it when you use the chat box. So please use the chat box if you want to guess the answer to this riddle. But a father and his son are involved in a horrific car crash, and the man died at the scene. But when the child arrived at the hospital and was rushed into the operating theater, the surgeon pulled away and said, "I can't operate on this boy. He's my son." How can this be? Help us answer the riddle, how this can be. And use, yes, Holly, you got it right on the first try. The mother is the surgeon. So, we have heard this riddle. I've heard it for over a decade, for years, but I did not realize that this riddle actually was involved with several psychological studies. Back in 2007, there were several universities that held a study alongside with this riddle. And at the time, people were saying all kinds of things. It was that there were 2 same-sex parents, that there were foster parents. They were giving all kinds of examples, but nobody was saying because the mom is the surgeon. We even know that some like Google translations or other translation devices, when you say nurse, will automatically use a she pronoun, or when you say doctor, might automatically translate to he. I know that there were some pretty social work advocates from the University of Wisconsin and all over several years ago that were trying to get that changed. But this helps us see how that implicit bias is there, and we don't even realize it. So now let's move back into talking about poverty and neglect. Poverty, we know, can be a risk factor for child maltreatment. We know child maltreatment is most likely to occur when families do not have their needs met. There's a lack of resources, there's high stress within that household, lack of social connections, isolation, and a misunderstanding of child development. So we know there's a correlation there, but it does not mean that the child is unsafe, ignored, unloved, or not cared for if there's poverty within a family. It costs more to be poor than it does to be rich. You've heard the saying that, or the riddle about the boots, where you've got a gentleman that might be buying $40 steel toe work boots, and he has to replace those work boots every 6 months because they wear out. When somebody who might be able to afford the $200 work boots gets to wear them for a longer period of time. Poverty contributes to increased scrutiny, monitoring of families, leading to more reports of maltreatment, more bias, class-based bias, and so on. So on a national scale, we were very enlightened at the Neglect Summit when we had Claire Anderson with Chapin Hall join us and help share a lot of the national trends and research that we're seeing. So earlier I mentioned that families below the poverty line, again, are 3 times more likely to be substantiated for maltreatment. We know economic disparities and historical system disadvantages fuel disproportionate child welfare involvement among families of color, and poverty-related risk factors like unemployment, housing instability, lack of child care lead to maltreatment reporting. While families experiencing poverty and economic hardship do have higher rates of maltreatment, the reporting data makes it difficult to parse these problems related solely to poverty. So what that is saying is that they can't find that correlation that says that these parents are willfully harming their kids. So let's look at our current definition of neglect in Kentucky. We talked about this at the beginning of the training. You know, abused or neglected child means a child whose health or welfare is harmed or threatened when they do not have adequate care, supervision, food, clothing, shelter, education, or medical care necessary to their well-being. Again, when caregivers are financially able to do so or offered financial means to do so. So breaking this down, the caregiver doesn't attend to the basic needs of the child, you know, such as those things we typically think of, like food, shelter, clothing, medical care, and supervision. So now we get to add that little underlined blurb for reasons other than poverty. Caregiver continuously or repeatedly fails, again, or refuses to provide that essential protection or care. So you know, a lot of times we see that there are situations where you have a single parent that's working 2 jobs. So they get paid on Friday, but the light bill was due on Wednesday. So they might have their electric cut off for a few days. Or you might have a parent who has to wait a few days before they can pay the copay to get a medication. You know, we know there are lots of families that are struggling with these issues, but are doing the best within their circumstances. It's wrong and it's neglect when these families are purposefully withholding those items from kids. When they have those opportunities, they're not providing them to their children. Neglected children may also be abandoned, homeless, or living in an environment that is injurious to their physical and emotional welfare. So again, this can include medical. So that also includes dental, environmental, exploitation, abandonment of the child, lack of supervision, lack of, could be hygiene, food, nutrition, substance use. We see that in Kentucky and across the nation, roughly 60 to 64% of substantiations involve substance abuse. It could be education, risk of harm, or domestic violence. So we get a lot of questions on environmental neglect, and thanks to U of L Division of Forensic Medicine, here is a good example of environmental neglect. Lee mentioned in my bio earlier that I've been with Prevent Child Abuse Kentucky since 2006. And we have a 1-800-CHILDREN helpline where anyone in the state can call us to get information on parenting, resources, and support. And throughout that time, I can recall answering a lot of 1-800-CHILDREN phone calls where people are asking questions about the filth in a house. So they might say, my neighbor's house is so dirty, or my granddaughter keeps her house a mess and I'm worried about the kids. So again, think about the bias there. I tend to be a neat and tidy person and I don't like clutter. But that doesn't mean when I walk into a house that might not align with what makes me comfortable that abuse or neglect is occurring. Now, the pictures in front of you scream an environmental hazard. You can type in the chat box if you want of all the things that you see that make this a hazard. I think if you consider, you see the cat running around, I have concerns about where's that litter box at? You see the dangers, the items on the table that can fall over. How could a kid walk through here? Spoiled food, yes. Tripping hazard, no clear pathway. No safe exit, yes. No fire escape. Great answers. So now I want us to look at another version of what some people would consider a mess. And I want us to look at this, and I want us to think about what strengths are we seeing in this picture. You know, I see this baby in the center that is on his or her tummy. And I think to myself, is this parent having tummy time because they understand that babies need to sleep on their back at night? I'm thinking that might be something I can talk to that family about. I see that as a strength, but I also see it as a learning opportunity. How can I talk to this parent to make sure that that little chair we see in the right-hand corner is secured safely and meets safety standards? But how can I talk to that parent about safe sleep from seeing this? You know, somebody might comment on the box. When, if you've been around 2, 3-year-olds, I mean, even my 9-year-old likes to play with boxes. So, you know, somebody might comment and see that box and think, well, there's trash all over the place, when in reality, that box might be a toy for a child that they enjoy far more than the gray car in the bottom of the picture. So folks have commented on those strengths. This is a house where kids play. Yes, I love that. Interaction with the baby on appropriate toys. Yes. And lots of toys for the kids to play with. So see, there's a lot of strengths for us to look at in this picture, while there also might be some opportunities for us to resource and help or support the family as well. So now when we recognize neglect, we think about those physical warning signs that might be obvious, like abandonment or lack of proper supervision, lack of adequate nutrition, or untreated illness or skin disorders. Behavioral warning signs. You could possibly see severe developmental lags, begging or stealing for food, inappropriately seeking affection, or chronically dirty or not bathed, being constantly tired, fatigued, or you might see a child that assumes adult responsibilities because that might be their role in that household. So when I think about and I look at all of these warning signs and physical signs, I think about all the areas here for, you know, that might be gray. So begs or steals for food. So I love telling this story on my bonus child because she and I share a love of food. And when she was in middle school, she had a gym teacher who always kept like Pringles and all these snacks and candy. So she would always go up to the gym teacher and say, hey, what have you got in there? Anything I can snack on? Well, she had a substitute teacher one day in that gym class, and she walks up to the sub and says, hey, is there anything in there that we can snack on? And you know, that phenomenal substitute teacher who is actually one of Prevent Child Abuse Kentucky's partners in prevention, he called her after class and said, hey, come here, I want to talk to you for a minute. And he says to her, he goes, you know, when you were asking for food, I just wanted to make sure that you had access to food and that you didn't need help getting food. And, you know, when she came home and told me this, she was embarrassed and mortified, and I was thrilled. I think I cried and did a yip because I was so thrilled that somebody was out there talking to her, not in front of others, but making sure she had her needs met. So again, we might see that these signs are definite indicators of neglect, but when we see that full picture, when we see the whole story, it might be a little different. So let's go through a little scenario. And again, feel free to use the chat box. This is Sam's story. So Sam was sitting on the front stoop in the late afternoon. Sam looked scruffy. The neighbors kept watch on Sam from inside their home. After 1 hour, the neighbor grew concerned and called the police and DCBS. Sam could not remember a parent's cell phone number, and an investigation was launched. Is this neglect or poverty? You all tell me, what do you think? Feel free to use that chat box. Poverty, yeah, people are asking Sam's age because that can make a difference. Exactly. Poverty, not enough information. Yes, Tammy. So Sam's caregiver was stuck at work and the family member who agreed to babysit was sick. Sam's parent couldn't afford childcare. So we see in this situation that, that parent had all of these things that they were facing, all of these things compounding on them for Sam to be on that front stoop alone. But I want you to tell me in that chat, what could the neighbor have done differently? Yes, why did the neighbor not go talk to Sam? Maybe ask some questions. Yes. So, it struck me in this story that the neighbor kept watch from the window for a full hour before going and talking to Sam, so they were making assumptions. And think about the opportunities there, the opportunities for support, for moving upstream and helping and resourcing a family to where maltreatment never even occurs. Here we have another scenario, which is Shelby's story. So 10-year-old Shelby has ongoing tooth pain. Shelby was attending a church youth group one evening. Shelby mentions to an adult that their tooth continues to hurt, but their mom won't take them to the dentist. Instead of the adult reaching out to Shelby's mother about what Shelby said, the adult calls DCBS and an investigation is accepted. So what about this story? Shelby's mother is a single mom and has depleted her PTO, her sick time at work. If she takes the time off, she will be fired. Shelby's mother has scheduled dentist appointments for her tooth, but can't find a trusted family member to take Shelby to the dentist, which we know having a trusted, safe adult is critical in our world. What could the adult who reported, what could they have done differently in this situation? Offered to help, talk to mom. Offered to take her. Yes. I think one thing that is up and coming that we're working on is a whole movement to help individuals understand the impact that shift work has on families. So that could be irregular shifts, like having a job where you might go into work various hours throughout the week, or it could be night shift. It could be working those non-typical 8 to 4 or 9 to 5 hours, and helping people understand the issues that these families have when it comes to meeting their kids' needs and helping that family thrive. So be on the lookout for that. But we've got to consider these types of things. Not only is it hard to find the dentist appointment, but does the dentist offer hours that are outside of 9 to 5? Are there dentist offices within a community or a county that do that we can help connect families to? Some communities have these wonderful dental buses that go around and help families. There's one clinic in Eastern Kentucky that was booked up at one point in time for 8 months. People couldn't get appointments for 8 months out. And, we see this across the state. So there are many factors that come to play here. So now let's talk about this, because yes, we want to support these families. We want to make sure that people are being good neighbors, helping hands, but we know that if we suspect abuse or neglect, we need to make that report. So we want to shift that lens from the very beginning of having a surveillance of families, like, oh, we're out the window, we're out to get them, what are they doing, to supporting families. So that when abuse or neglect is not yet occurring, when that support is there, we can prevent that abuse or neglect from occurring. So I want us to shift and think, all Kentuckians, we know we're mandated supporters or reporters. That's one reason that we, when we say Kentucky ranks #1 or 5th, it's like apples to oranges, because some states around us, not everyone is a mandated reporter of maltreatment like we are. But we know we're mandated reporters of suspected maltreatment, but I want you to think about what would happen if everybody chose to be a community supporter prior to that abuse or neglect ever occurring. If they believed a family to be struggling, imagine if they reached out for help, just the impact that that could have. So you'll see, as we're moving forward with this work, we're shifting that lens to help people understand we want to move upstream. We want to prevent maltreatment. So before we get to the point of we're suspecting abuse or neglect happening, we're going to step in and support our families. Or if we know it's not abuse or neglect, but it might be poverty or lack of resources, we're not going to pick up the phone and call DCBS because we think it's their problem. We're going to provide support and help reach out with services or be a listening ear. Even if people don't know of the resources, they can think of places like 211 or Connect that they can direct families to. So now it's important people know where to report. So I wanted to make sure that we included that information in this training. In our state law is that you can report to law enforcement, the county or Commonwealth attorney, and the Cabinet for Health and Family Services. So here is that information, making sure that we know that statewide centralized intake is available from 8 to 4:30 at 1-800-752-6200. We also have the web option, the web link available for individuals, but that is not an emergency situation. We don't want to have an emergency situation and use the web link. After hours, weekends, and holidays, we have the reporting number that's easier to remember, 1-877-KY-SAFE-1. So we still want to make sure people are reporting, but we want to shift that lens. We want to shift the focus to where everybody is accepting responsibility for prevention and stepping up and being a community supporter. So now let's look at the family dynamics in Kentucky when we're talking about this work. We know that 20.9% of children in our state live in poverty, and 45% of children live in low-income families. At least 1 in every 5 Kentucky children of color experienced food insecurities in 2020. I read a report just earlier today as I was creating another presentation, and I saw that grandparents raising grandchildren were at high rates of food insecurity in our state, more so than other caregivers. 24,177 public school students experienced homelessness during the 2018-2019 school year. And then again, we know that families living below the poverty line are again 3 times more likely to be substantiated for maltreatment. So we know these factors. We know again that when families do not have the social supports, the social connections, when they're isolated, They don't understand those realistic expectations for what their kids should be doing during each developmental stage. When they don't have their basic needs met and are under extreme stress, we know that contributes to maltreatment. So in Kentucky, one of the outcomes of the Neglect Summit was folks wanted common messaging. They wanted a framework that they could go to guide them in talking with everyone about this movement of being a community supporter. So alongside support from the Department for Community-Based Services, Prevent Child Abuse Kentucky is soon launching Lean on Me Kentucky. And it's all about this shift. It's all about how we can support families before that abuse or neglect occur. If we know what contributes to that maltreatment, and if we know what strengthens families, if we know about protective factors, which we'll get into here in a minute, then, sign me up. Let's start this. I wish we could start it now. So my ask of you attending this training is to move upstream with us and consider this. We saw a comment in the chat box that sometimes offering help can backfire. And I'm sure a lot of us have been in that position. I've offered help and it's backfired on me, but I would much rather take that leap to help and offer support to a family than to have not, and eventually it lead to potential abuse or neglect. One of my pet peeves is on social media when a parent will let the whole world know, it could be their 200 to 5,000 Facebook friends, and they say, anybody open to watching my kids on Friday night between 5 to 7? And I think, oh my goodness, there's a better way to go about this. So I'll message people and I'll say, hey, just want you to know I've included some resources for childcare, safe childcare in Kentucky, and some things to consider when, choosing a babysitter. I've had people block me and unfriend me, but I'd much rather take that leap than not. So we know research has shown us, hopefully everybody on here is familiar with adverse childhood experiences. We did a study, COVID gives me brain fog. So it's been since the start of the pandemic, maybe 2 years ago, we launched a survey across the Commonwealth to determine the understanding of ACEs with our service providers. And what we found was that service providers knew about ACEs. They knew that when kids face adverse childhood experiences, when they're exposed to stressful environments without a buffer, that it leads to negative long-term outcomes. Then Prevent Child Abuse America and this group called Social Current did their own study to find that the general public also understood that when kids have adversity, when they have child maltreatment, domestic violence, an incarcerated family member, living in an environment with substance use, that the general population also understood that when our kids have adverse childhood experiences, they know they lead to negative long-term outcomes. What people don't have information on and what they need is the positive factors. So what we're seeing is a movement to where we're stopping where we say ACEs all the time, but we're saying PACEs, positive and adverse childhood experiences. Because think back to all of the social messaging and communication science that I talked about at the beginning of this training. People understand the problem. We have bombarded them by talking about the problem, but we need to provide those solutions. And what we know through hundreds of studies is that there are protective factors that, when put into practice and supported, put into practice with a family or child, that it can tip the scale, that it can be that barrier and that buffer to support that family to increase their likelihood of positive outcomes in the future versus those negative. And we have, again, thinking of the strengths, we have Kentucky Strengthening Families in our state. So over a decade ago, out of the Governor's Office of Early Child Care and Education, they launched Kentucky Strengthening Families with folks from across the state to implement this protective factor framework into our state. So it already exists. We just have to take advantage of it. And what it looks like is making sure that our parents are resilient, that they can bounce back in times of need. So when I think of Shelby's story or Sam's story earlier, you know, if that neighbor might have helped out with childcare, if Sam's mom had an employer that was willing to work with her on taking Sam to appointments, think about how that builds resilience for the parent. Social connections, you know, in order to have supports that help you with those things, social connections are critical. They're important. Knowledge of child development. Again, we know that having unrealistic expectations for how our kids should behave and develop contributes to maltreatment. You know, I'll never forget hearing somebody say the phrase, "Oh, my baby's just doing that to get on my nerves." And I thought, oh no, they can't. The baby's brain is not developed enough to sit there and think I'm doing this just to spite you. So we got to make sure we help educate our parents so that they understand what our kids do at each developmental stage and what they can expect. Concrete support in times of need are significant. I'm going to give some studies and some data here in a bit that highlight that. Nurturing and attachment. Again, I'm going back to shift work. Think about parents that might work 2 jobs. My mom was one. My mom worked 2 jobs. And think about the lack of opportunities that were there for that nurturing and attachment, that bonding, that ability to check on the homework, to make sure you're doing things okay, to even know if you're having trouble with homework. You know, my daughter talks about this little boy who has a hard time getting his planner signed. And he always has to walk laps and he gets in trouble. And I'm like, Anna, I say to her, do his parents work a lot? And she looks at me and goes, how do you know? And I'm like, man, I wish that teacher would just like work something out with the family, or, you know, try to support this family, because in one guess, you know, I'm figuring out what's going on. The other thing that we see is social emotional competence. You know, we have to make sure that we are helping our youth at a very young age. You know, it starts as a baby, develop the skills to help them regulate their behavior, to make friends, to be able to handle themselves in certain situations. So now let's look at the risks that we've been talking about and look at the protective factors that correlate. So we know maltreatment increases for kids ages 4 years of age and younger. So how can we combat that? You know, strong social supportive networks. Children with special health care needs, you know, that takes a great deal on a family. I think about, again, the role of providers in making sure that families can have access to services outside of 8 to 5 and 9 to 5. I think of the extra supports that are needed within that household. Incarceration, which we know in Kentucky, we have one of the highest populations for incarcerated caregivers. And isolation is significant. You know, and isolation can look very different. You know, I have a family member who lives in Eastern Kentucky, and her cell phone doesn't work very well at her house. And her husband works at a factory 2 hours away. So he gets in the car early in the morning before anybody else gets up, drives to work, and gets home where he's got only a few minutes before everybody's going to bed. So there's that type of isolation, as well as you can have somebody that lives in a very urban environment with things going on around them that might not have those social connections and have a different form of isolation. Poverty, limited resources, unemployment, and financial stressors. We know single parents are juggling all of these things on their own, and family violence. So when we think about the what can we do, we can think of things like stable, positive relationships. How can that help assist with our kids with special health care needs and the siblings and the parents that might be in that home? Caregivers that are present and interested in the child. Again, I think of those parents working 2 jobs, how critical this is for them. Enforcement of household rules and engagement and monitoring kids. Again, I think of the start of the pandemic when folks went home and how everything was turned upside down, how important that routine was. I think of, seeing my kid today and how important her routine is for homework and eating and having that mealtime together as a family at the table. And caring adults outside of a family. We know that safe, stable, nurturing relationships for kids and family members is one of the strongest protective factors that there are. So here we look at risk again. We might see substance use or untreated mental illness issues. You might have ignorance of child development, abuse or neglect during childhood of the parent, low income or educational attainment, interpersonal violence, use of corporal punishment. So what's our protective? How can we tip the scale? Again, you're going to see that social connection, the caregivers who create safe and positive relationships. I saw a daycare out in Western Kentucky, and I did a training for them about 10 years ago. And they had, it was the coolest concept, but they had a buddy program where if a parent might be new to town or might not have a lot of friends, they would kind of buddy them up with other parents that attend the daycare center, or they would have small little gatherings for the parents where it wouldn't be overwhelming, where they might come in and there were only 3 or 4 people that could talk about common things. So they would ask you if you're having trouble with cooking and working and making sure your family has healthy meals. They would have a topic night where folks can come together and collaborate over that subject. Or it might be, I'm struggling helping my kid that's 8 with their homework. So they might have groups around that. Practice of nurturing parenting skills, providing emotional support. Again, there's the making sure our basic needs are met and educational attainment and steady employment. I'm so thrilled to see this shift in our state where folks think college is the answer. College might not be the answer for everybody. I'm sure that my plumber makes a whole lot more money than I do and went to a whole lot less school. There are a lot of different opportunities with trade schools and programs that are out there for folks to take advantage of. And remember that every case of maltreatment is unique. So what might work for one family might not work for another. We see that high rates of violence and crime, are significant. We need to have safe and stable housing for our families. High rates of poverty, limited educational and economic opportunities, few community activities or supports. I think that there are a few what I call hidden gems. I stole that from our executive director, Jill. She has this phrase, they're hidden gems. And I think we have some hidden gems in our communities. I learned the other day that community collaborations for children and their in-home services, anybody can refer to those services. We have hands. So folks that go in and help new parents with their new bundle of joy. Anybody can refer to the hands program, and it is free of charge. You could live in poverty, you could be rich, it doesn't matter. You can apply and get support from the hands program. We have our extension offices throughout the state who have lots of programming. I saw one the other day had babysitting classes for middle schoolers. They have a whole lot of great stuff going on. So you all point us to some other, what you consider hidden gems throughout your communities in the chat box. So what are some different opportunities or resources or places in your community you think are there, but others might not know about? Community action, yes. I saw where some community actions have those great programs where they will give you a box of fruits and vegetables, and sometimes families don't know how to cook an artichoke. I wouldn't. So they do little classes on how to use the tools or the food that they're giving you. Baby pantry, church food banks, family resource use service centers, yes. First steps. Federated transportation is a new one for me. I'm writing that down to find out more. And if you wouldn't mind to put a little explanation in the chat box, that would be awesome. Public libraries, yes, our libraries, definitely a hidden gem. Family to family health information is that center. Lots of great ideas. I want to make sure I don't miss any. Kiwanis clubs. We have the Nest in Lexington. Yes, Janet Lewis, we do. The Nest is a great, unique place that has emergency childcare services. They have a basic needs pantry, domestic violence services, parent education classes. Medicaid providers have a lot of services too. So like WellCare health plans, Aetna, and all of the others, and God's Pantry. So we're seeing here, we see a lot of these great hidden gems. So I think that a lot of times when we're considering resourcing families, we might not know where to start. You might be like me, where you offer a resource and somebody gets mad and defriends you on Facebook. But I think there are other opportunities that are out there. You know, there are bulletin boards and childcare centers, there are newsletters, there's advertising something on our Facebook. You know, we never know which one of our friends might be in need, and just how important it would be to advertise something like that, like MOPS, Mothers of Preschoolers. We see again that there might be food deserts. And that is something that has really hit home for me. I went to a conference several years ago, and at that event, they gave us a homework assignment. There on site, they told us, think of the community in which you live and write down all of the places that you can locate free food to help in times of need. So I'm sitting there and I'm feeling pretty proud, like, oh yeah, I've got 17 places written down. I'm killing this. Man, this is awesome. I get home, I send an email out to my network and I say, okay, I need a list of all the food pantries, places you can get food in our community. Do you know, by the end of that day, there were a list of 38. So here I was feeling so proud that I came up with 17 when there were 38 different opportunities that people let me know about. So we've got to make sure that we're finding out these resources so that we can share them. You know, you might be in your field for 20 years and think, oh, I've got a grip on this, but we're continual learners. There are different groups popping up daily, different opportunities. So networking with other providers and other members of the community to find these resources. We also see that there's little engagement among neighbors. So that's one reason that we see public education campaigns are so critical. And that spans the gamut. We have seen that research has shown public education campaigns can be pretty significant when trying to kind of do a culture shift or a change in how people perceive a certain problem and its solutions. So anything that we can do to help spread this message or the thought of being that community supporter is pretty significant. So now I want us to think of, when it comes to a family and Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we're going back to school, and we're going to talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So I want us to think about each level here and think about a child or a family living in poverty and the psychological component. So the basic needs for physical survival, such as food, water, and a livable environment. I think from what I'm hearing and seeing, folks kind of get that. They know families need to have their basic needs met. But think about the next level, safety, protection, and security. So feeling and being safe from harm. How do you think that level on the pyramid impacts families in poverty? And again, feel free to type in the chat box. Feeling and being safe from harm, from family members, strangers. Anxiety, yes. Stress. A level of trauma that impacts these families, most definitely. Living in an environment that is where kids are constantly under stress can be an adverse childhood experience. Disabilities. Think about it from the standpoint of poverty. So if a family is living in poverty, might it be hard to escape this type of living situation? We know how vital social emotional competence is. We know how vital social connections are. So might families be embarrassed or less hesitant for their kids to have friends over from school, for people to come into their home? If they might want a hands worker to come into their home, might they feel comfortable doing that? So now belongingness and love. Members of families, school communities, and groups, and love from family, friends, and significant other. How might that impact our families in poverty? Again, feel free to use that chat box. If your parents working all the time, they might love you more than anything on the face of the earth, but it might be a little hard for them to show you because they're very tired. They're never around. You might feel like you're not good enough. Yes, exactly. It impacts that social connection component. So now think about how also does that impact esteem? So one's self-esteem. Status and public recognition, the sense of competence and confidence. Might feel alone, inferior, might feel like they don't have anyone. You know, I think about what an emphasis, you know, our society puts on clothing and what you wear and the brands that you wear, and how, you know, how difficult that is for kids going into school. Identity, worthlessness, hopelessness, yes. And then reaching your full potential. If a child, again, is, you know, they might want to go to prom, but don't know where they're going to get the funding to get a prom dress. They might want to join the beta club, but they can't pay the $20 and they're afraid to ask their parent because They know that the electricity is out and it's not going to come back on till Friday, till the parents paid. We know poverty impacts all these levels that we know through this hierarchy of needs we need to thrive, to reach our full potential. So let's look at those protective factors and meeting the basic needs. We know research, all of these studies have shown us, this one got me the first time I heard it, a $1 minimum wage increase decreases child maltreatment neglect reports by 9.6%. A 10% increase in state welfare benefits for a family of 4 reduces foster care placements by 8%. One additional store accepting SNAP, 11.3% decrease in substantiations of maltreatment. And states with child care subsidies have less removals than other states that don't. Here are ways that you can find out more information on this research. We've seen that even modest increases in family income positively impact child abuse and neglect rates. Things like earned income tax credits have been associated with reductions of entry into foster care. Families receiving child support were less likely to be subject to a CPS report than mothers who did not receive it. And small increases again in minimum wage were associated with declines in maltreatment, specifically neglect. I don't know about you all, but the first time I heard those and read those studies, it was like mind blown. Youth living in poverty, we know it impacts them. Poverty can influence emotions, behavior, brain structure, cognitive capacity, attitudes, and more. It can have limited access to appropriate health care. There have been studies that have shown kids that have grown up in poverty have a different mindset of going for well child visits or going to be seen when you're sick. Therefore, as they age and get older and have their own families, their concept of when to seek help for being sick is a little bit altered. Chronic stress, lack of supervision, again, due to parents working multiple jobs or incarceration, and it can have parental stress with the impact that has on the home life. So what can we do? I think self-care, not only for our families, but for us as providers, because if we're not practicing self-care, and whatever self-care is to us, it's another pet peeve of mine when people provide self-care ideas and it's things that might cost money or, things that might not be attainable. I think we need to help folks understand and learn that self-care is different for everyone. And we need to teach them small things that they can incorporate into their daily life. Teaching social and emotional skills, greeting family members by name. I forget my neighbors' names, and luckily my 9-year-old is a pro at it. And so when we're walking the dog, I will constantly say, "What's their name?" And she'll whisper it to me and I'll say, "Hey, Bob, how are you today?" Engage with, when possible, with youth and listen. Sometimes we don't have the answer. It's hard to reach out and help families when you don't have the answer, but oftentimes it can be as simple as, "Hey, are you going through something? I might be a listening ear. I might not know how to help you, but at least I can listen." Model appropriate behavior and understand the positive and adverse childhood experiences. Again, if we're constantly talking to providers and members of the community about these are adverse childhood experiences and these are the negative outcomes they have, we've got to have those solutions. We have to make sure that we're presenting solutions so that people know what they can do and so that they believe that we can combat those experiences and connect our families to available resources. So there has been, there are several studies. This one is related to education, but I think we can make a parallel no matter what environment we're working in or we're in our daily walk of life. You know, you might be thinking about implementing some of this in your church or your place of worship. But research has shown that school culture has a tremendous positive role in helping youth at risk find success in and out of school. You know, we could say the same for after school programs, child care centers, again, places of worship. For high levels of excellence, graduation, positive futures, here's some key things that through this research we know we must do. Surround students with a positive educational atmosphere. Again, it might be another environment that is positive in nature. Overcome that helplessness with optimism. You know, we not only want the people that we want to help everyone in the community to understand that we can solve this problem, but we want people to know, whether it's a youth or a family, that problems are solvable. We want to instill that locus of control, that people have power over their lives and decisions, and replace that despair with hope so that they have things to look forward to. They have a feeling of self-worth, that they value and that they matter. So here I have a little video to close us out on. The CDC Veto Violence Center is spearheading a lot of this work as we look at positive outcomes for families. So I wanted to share one of their new videos with you all today.
My future yesterday could have looked another way. A view from this podium from where I shot my past today. My neighborhood could have stood vacant, lots abandoned. No ground for play, sidewalks, parks. Or by day and after dark, nervous, leaving our houses. My babysitters might have been cold cereal and TV friends. With bills to pay, no living wage. Mom works 2 jobs, leaves us to stay alone. The struggle's private. Don't know where there's public help. My family's future would have remained marked by my sister's illness. Medical bills, financial strain. Seeing my parents fight, hearing their raised voices. Uninsured and afraid, it's tough to make choices. But my future yesterday did not become a tale of caution. I rose above because you saw your future in me. Our community became extended family. Opening doors when my parents needed more. They found people to help, local resources. Our home visitor taught us skills to manage stressful situations, like my sister's sickness, connected our family with health services. Our outside supports built inside stability. Dad's new skills and found job led to shared kitchen creativity. Full hearts and full bellies, priceless conversations. Mom working 1 job eased our situation. Our community planted pride in me. These hands harvested food, fed families. Greening our community means people garden, see neighbors, friends, outdoors. Today, I stand before you because yesterday, you stood behind me. My future yesterday is our celebration today, and our stronger tomorrow. The story you've just seen represents more than one person's experiences. We're going to highlight 3 of the many ways in which you can help stop adverse childhood experiences before they start. Everyone plays a role. You can too. Learn how to create positive relationships and environments for all children in your community. Visit vetoviolence.cdc.gov.
I just love that video. I don't know about you all, but I think it really summarizes this training and the movement, the work that we're trying to go towards. So I would encourage you, as you're trying to help us get the idea of being a community supporter statewide, to utilize tools like this. So here is again that what can I do to help slide that is just a recap of the one that we have already seen. But I want to focus on the next two slides with the remaining few minutes that we have together. So I talked about the Neglect Summit and the movement that we knew needed to occur to help people conceptualize the idea of resourcing families and supporting their neighbors and reaching out to prevent child neglect from occurring. So we held 9 different focus groups from across the state that led to a lot of information, some of which helped guide today's training and other work that we're doing. But we will soon be releasing a toolkit with action cards and resources and trainings that will correlate with this whole concept of leaning on your neighbor, leaning on your friend, promoting self-care within yourself and others, and the idea and concept of being that community supporter. So if you would like to make sure you get this information, I'm going to type my email in the chat box so that you can email me and say, hey, Janna, make sure that I'm on a list. So when you all launch this, I know about it. I will forward it to my coworker, but if you email me, we'll put you on that list. So today in closing, there's 5 things I want you to consider as you step away from this training. And that one is take care of yourself, because if you are not taking care of you, how can you take care of others? So please, whatever that is for you, take care of yourself. Remember the risk factors. So if there are opportunities to help families, then please make sure that within your comfort level or safety to do so, that you take advantage of that. If you're in situations where you can advocate, you might hear somebody talking about a family that's in poverty in a light that's not good. You know, step up and speak up for that family. It might be advocacy or education. Reach out, be the listening ear, help share resources and support and raise the issue. So help us reframe this message and enlighten others with what you've learned and get them thinking of that shift of how they can support and be that community supporter, so that we're reacting and responding before maltreatment starts instead of after. And again, we do not want people to not make reports. If they suspect maltreatment, they have got to make that report of abuse or neglect. So if it's suspected, make sure that we're sharing the 1877 KY Safe number on where to report to. So that is it for me today. I have put my email address, our phone number on here. If you have want any further research, or I don't answer your questions through the chat today, I would love to provide those answers or other supports to you. But if you have questions, please put it in the chat. Somebody had asked about handouts. So Lee, I'm not sure if you all have a way to distribute handouts or a way to get those, but I'm more than happy to make them available.
I can drop them in the chat right now.
Awesome. Thank you. Finding safe childcare resources. Jessica, it's like you know what we're working on. Not that everybody will be available, but on December 7th, we are having sort of it's not really a summit, but it kind of is. It's like a shift work summit where we are going to have somebody from Child Care Aware talk to us about the importance of childcare and the resources available to us in Kentucky. So if you can't attend that training, again, email me and I'll make sure you get that information. I would go to Child Care Aware, Google them. You can also go to Connect connect.gov, and there is a section on childcare that will link to regulated agencies within the state. Making sure I'm answering all questions because I want to make sure everybody's heard.
Janna, there was one that said, do you by any chance have a toolkit for mental health in our incarcerated populations?
I do not. And off the top of my head, it's funny you say that because at one point we did write a grant to create that very thing that was not created. I can't off the top of my head, but I can ask around to see if that person wants to email me. I'll send an email out to a few folks. I think if something like that exists, they might know where to find it.
And someone also asked, is there data that shows a difference in poverty and or neglect since COVID?
So there has been a recent report that I have not had time to read that goes into child maltreatment throughout the span of COVID, because what they have seen is there's so much information out there and misinformation, and kind of a difficult way to determine what went on. What we can tell you is that physical abuse, we know that the level of acuity, so the cases that hospitals were seeing were more severe during COVID than before, as well as numbers of those cases, but that's not neglect. But there is a new report out there, but I'm just not sure from reading the summary that it's going to have that specific correlation. So if something like that is out there, I don't know about it, but would love, would love to see it if it is.
And another question was, with neglect regarding medical care, is there any difference or consideration made regarding religious beliefs? For example, families who do not believe in medical treatment or specific types of medical treatment.
So that I feel like I am not equipped to answer. I would refer you to DCBS or to, you know, somebody that more so specializes in that area of work. I don't know if there's anybody from DCBS in the chat box that would like to chime in and answer that, but I don't think I would feel comfortable venturing into that territory. Sorry.
We have several from DCBS in the chat. If they haven't left yet, maybe they could at least type a phone number or email address that they could connect with.
That would be awesome.
And I feel like that may be the case for the next question too. It's pretty specific to DCBS. It's in the Q&A, Janna, if you want to look at it.
Let's see. Okay, someone that heard. She knows someone that her daughter's dad's girlfriend had the kids taken away due to abuse. What should the mother of the child do to make sure their daughter is safe when she is with her dad? The dad and the girlfriend do live together. So I hope that there's communication with that family. When there are two parents that are on the same page, it can be a beautiful thing. We have a resource called Are They Good for Your Kids that helps people identify. So hopefully if dad would be willing, this brochure kind of goes through the red flags, things to look for if your kid is in a situation that might not be safe. So it helps look at those factors of what to look for when you've got a love interest that's around your child. And again, that is Are they good for your kids? You can go to pcaky.org to our information and data center and find that brochure. And then as it relates to the medical neglect question, folks can reach out to the Child Protection Branch Manager, Tara Cecil. And that has been provided in the Q&A if folks, not sure if they can see that. But Tara Cecil, the Protection Branch Manager, would be a great contact for the medical neglect question. And thank you, Lee, she posted that in there. And that's it. Awesome.
Thank you so much, Janna. That was excellent. You got lots of kudos in the chat box, and I feel pretty confident that people are going to be following up on your website and possibly to your email. So thank you again for joining us today.
Good. I hope so. And I will stop sharing.